Dahr that I feel would be worthy enough of him. That's how I feel about Dahr. Everybody that's ever met Dahr, knows Dahr, really loves him. And I'm a member of the veterans community. My husband was a Vietnam veteran. And when Dahr was earlier in his career and I was doing a lot of organizing, he stayed with us. And my husband was a Vietnam veteran, and Dahr had just gotten back from Iraq and had written his book on the soldiers within Iraq who were saying no. And it was, I cannot tell you, it doesn't matter what war you're in, if you're in Vietnam or you're in Afghanistan or you're in Iraq, the war experience itself and the experience that the families go through with their veteran spouses and family members is just so deep and so all encompassing that the avenue from heart to heart connection is definitely there. And so my husband and Dahr really connected. And when my husband died, Dahr so kindly wrote a eulogy for him. And thank you, Dahr. So I'm just saying we all love him. But besides being a man of heart and a man of wisdom, he comes to the understanding of militarism and climate change with that background. And he went into journalism with the understanding that the United States media, the media we were getting here was just not up to speed. And so he courageously went to Iraq himself as an independent journalist, an unembedded journalist. And for those of you who understand what that means, an unembedded journalist, you don't have the protection of the military, but you have the freedom to express the truth. And Dahr's experience there was such that when he would go to some sort of event that had occurred and there was an incident that happened, what he found out was that the story on the ground was completely different from the one that we were getting back in the US. So Dahr has just such an incredible history with the books he's written, the articles he's written, the role he's played in educating us all. So he also came by his knowledge of climate disruption early on because he was always out and about and he loved the mountains and he was in Alaska and he saw firsthand what was going on. And of course had to go investigate and write on incident after incident. And he's won so many awards in his young life. Dahr, sorry, forgive me, I'm so old now. And that I didn't even want to begin to try to list off all of the awards he's won, and all of the papers that he's written for. And but I will tell you the languages that he's written in, which is that have been his work has been translated into. So that's French, Polish, German, French, Polish, Dutch, Spanish, Japanese, Portuguese, Chinese, Arabic, and Turkish. He's appeared on BBC, Democracy Now!, Al Jazeera, NPR, and numerous other stations around the world, radio and TV. I think one of the highest compliments that Dahr got was from Howard Zinn. And what Howard Zinn had to say about Dahr was, Dahr, means so much. He's a superb journalist in the most honorable tradition of that craft. And I think that really just says it all. So the book that he's here to talk to us about today is The End of Ice. And it was one of Smithsonian Magazine's 10 best science books of 2019. So Dahr, we're all very glad to have you. You've got the floor. Thank you so much.
Actually, I have the floor for just a second.
Oh, okay,
so
sorry.
I just wanted to mention that I believe I've muted everybody except for myself and Dahr and Cindy. And so in this initial stage, as Dahr presents, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. And depending on how many people we have, we will go into breakout rooms at some point. But right now, it was sort of on teeter-tottering between, we could have a discussion of the whole and breakout. So hopefully Sally will give us an assist when we're ready to do that. And with that, Dahr, please take it away.
Well, thanks, Earl, and thank you, Cindy. And yeah, so the rest of everybody else, thanks for coming. And we had decided that I would just chat for probably about 10 minutes or so about the main topic that I wanted to really present to the group for a conversation today. And so the book that I wrote, as Cindy mentioned, I spent several years working on it. It really was my swan song in journalism, in that I had been aware of the climate crisis for a long, long time and knew I wanted to start covering it in depth. And I did so starting around 2010 when I moved out of war journalism, and ended up getting a chance to go basically around the world to a lot of the hot spots and where the most devastating impacts are happening already from the climate crisis. So I got to go to places like the Amazon rainforest and the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, and back up on Denali in Alaska and other places around Alaska, Glacier National Park, Sequoia National Park, and all these other different places around the world, to basically go out into the field with leading scientists studying those areas. And I intentionally chose scientists who had minimum 20 years studying the area they were studying, many of them upwards of 30, 40, even Thomas Lovejoy in the Amazon, who's been studying that longer than I've been alive. And go out, my point is going out into these places with scientists who had a long-term intimate relationship with these places. And the culmination of that, I brought it all together into the book, and I wrote it in a way of kind of a frontline reportage to try to give people the personal, visceral experience of what it's like to go experience these places, both in their magnificence and also the travesty of what's happening and the heartbreak, and really bring that out, since most of us won't get to go see these places around the world and see it right now as this is happening in real time. And then, of course, the book's been very scientifically vetted and heavily footnoted. There's 21 pages of footnotes. So if anybody wants to read the reports themselves of the studies of what's happening, then that's available too. But the thing that I think is really the most important part of this now, that I'm looking at in my work and I want to talk about today, is, what do we do with this information? And that's where the grief part comes in. And so the subtitle of my book is Bearing Witness and Finding Meaning in the Path of Climate Disruption. And going through the book process brought me to a point personally where I was at wit's end. I felt despair. I kind of felt like, what's the point? All is lost. We're completely off the cliff. Because that was the sum message of basically every area I looked at, as I wrote each chapter, whether it was about what's happening to corals around the planet, or glaciers, or forests, or go on down the line, biological diversity, everything was in a beyond dire emergency situation. In a lot of instances, it looks like, that, like for the Great Barrier Reef as example, it's lost. It's in its terminal stage. And anybody here with kids, like the kids, if they went and saw the Great Barrier Reef right now, they're going to be the last generation to see it, what's left of it still alive. And so what to do with all that grief, and what the book, I literally got to the last chapter of the book and was like, I have no idea how to end this book. There aren't any like cliche things I can say, or like, go change light bulbs, or, recycle. Like we're completely going into a new era now on the planet, where we're in the sixth mass extinction. And, the planet I got to grow up with, and most of you got to grow up with, is not going to be the same planet. It's already not the same planet. And certainly when we depart, it's not going to be the same. And so what do we do? Like I don't have my own kids, but I have a niece and nephews, and I have dear friends that have children. And so what do we do? How do I find a way to keep doing work in being of service, knowing all of this catastrophic information. And so the book forced me to really start investigating some of this and really kind of going more deeply into it. And, first I came across one quote by Stephen Jenkinson. He's a Canadian author and storyteller and writer, and he worked for decades in the palliative care industry, and so had a really intimate knowledge and working relationship with death. And I want to read a quote from his that I have in my book. It's from a talk he gave at Simon Fraser University up on Vancouver Island. And he says, "The question is not, are we going to fail? The question is how." And he's talking about in regards to the climate crisis. He says, "The question is, what shall be the manner of our inability to care for what was entrusted to us? The question is our manner of failing." He went on to say, "Grief requires us to know the time we're in. The great enemy of grief is hope. Hope is the four-letter word for people who are willing to know things for what they are. Our time requires us to be hope-free, to burn through the false choice of being hopeful and hopeless. They are two sides of the same con job. Grief is required to proceed." And from there, really letting that sink in to me brought me in. I came across another quote that really helped, that I included in the book, that I wanted to share today. It's quite short. It's by Czech dissident writer and statesman Václav Havel, who wrote, "Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something is worth doing, no matter how it turns out." And then from that rolled me into right around this time when I was pulling together this concluding chapter. I met an indigenous elder named Stan Rushworth of Cherokee heritage. And he talked to me. He said, "Look, in indigenous culture, we have a really different perspective than in the dominant Western culture." He says, "In your culture, you're raised to believe we have rights, right? Like, what are my rights?" He said, "Well, in ours, we're raised with we're all born onto the earth with two primary obligations. One is to be good stewards of the earth, and two is to serve future generations of all species." And so that for me was like a pivot point. That's what really brought all this together, where if I get up each morning and I think, how can I serve those two primary obligations? Then doing something based on like long-term results, like, oh, I need to go do this to try to solve the climate crisis on my own and be completely overwhelmed. Like, I got to set that aside and then get up and say, okay, what can I do right here to try to make this place a little bit better place for the future generations of all species? And so I always have work to do if I'm going to try to fulfill those two obligations that I was reminded of by my friend that I have and that I believe that we all have. So that's really helped me immensely in kind of getting up and facing the day. And this has really come into even sharper focus when we look at how intense the last year has been with the pandemic and, the coup attempt on the Capitol on January 6th, and the current ongoing kind of state of chronic crisis politically that this country's in, the economic crisis that continues. I mean, everything, the everything crisis that besets us. So whether it's just the climate or all these other things or all of it together, these are just a few of the things that I've really come across that have really, really helped me, that I wanted to present to you today in hopes that it would at least generate some good discussion. And I would look forward to hearing more from everybody as well about some of the things that folks do to help us kind of keep our spirits up and stay active during this time where things are so intense. And, the one thing that's for sure is they're only going to continue to intensify. So, and I thought I would leave any climate questions or anything like that. Of course, I'm happy to get into, but I thought that, given this group of people, and I know what the Unitarians are about, that that this would be a kind of a better fodder for discussion for today.
Thank you so much. You spoke to the portion of your book that was of most interest to me because of how many people I have seen burned out doing climate work. It is easy to enter into despair. And it's a nice place to visit, but you don't want to live there. And so thanks, that really helps. We have 24 participants, and I think it would be probably best if we did go into breakout rooms with maybe 4 participants in each. And the 3 questions that you will be discussing in your group is, what did you hear? What do you think? And what more do you want to know? And Sally is saying, how do we do breakouts? I thought you knew how to do that.
Well, hang on, let me see. Okay, assign automatically, create 4 breakout rooms, right? Okay.
No, if it's 24 of
Create
us.
6, you want 4 in each, right? Okay.
Yeah, and actually we probably now we're down to 23, so you may want to do 5.
Excuse me, I'm told by my wife who tried to get in on Zoom that there's a whole bunch of people trying to get in. Do you have to admit them?
No. That's the password if they need it, but I don't know how to get that to everybody else. It's also on Facebook Live, which of course does not enable them to be part of the breakouts. But we do not have a waiting room if.
I got in without a waiting room and without a password, so I don't quite
Because
understand.
you had the link that had the password embedded in it, which is not the first one we sent out. We just sent that out yesterday. Anybody who had the earlier link would have needed the password.
Uh-huh, all right.
Because
I tried the Facebook and couldn't find it on Facebook. I came here.
It was supposed. That's something else that Terry was going to do, and he's done it before. It says, yeah, it says waiting for live video. That's really bizarre because it's supposed to be playing.
So can you,
Hey.
Sally, can you put the password in the chat?
I just did.
Oh, great, thank you.
But that
okay, so we're now down to 23. So that would be one less group than before. If we want to make groups of, well, the math doesn't work any way we do it. Why did we have to end up with a prime number?
The people in the chat are asking to keep everybody together. So.
Okay, is that, I see. Well, let's do it this way. Thumbs up if you want to stay together, thumbs down if you want to break. Okay, let's stay together then. So what I see some people already, if you click on participants, you will get a separate screen. At the bottom of that screen, it says, raise your hand is one of the options. And if you raise your hands, it'll show up on the screen. So at this point, if anybody would like to ask a question, I'll unmute them and we'll rock and roll. Okay, Robert. And let me find you on the screen here so I can unmute you. Is this Robert? No, it's Robert Sullivan.
Yes. We can unmute ourselves. Earl.
Okay, why don't you do
Please
that?
do, everybody.
Robert, I don't see you
Just be
on my
polite.
screen. There you are. You're right at the top. Okay, go for it.
Can you hear me already?
Yes, we can.
All right, thank you. First of all, Dahr, I want to ask you a question about a person. Do you remember Jonathan Henderson? Jonathan Henderson in Louisiana.
Of course.
Yes. Your partner took one of the finest pictures of him that I've ever seen. He was my student. And he was very affected by your visit here. As I am affected by your statement that to be between hopeful and hopeless, I understand that. And I'm trying to wrap my head around it. And I'm wondering if you could help me do that.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, and thanks for reminding me of our mutual friend down there. We did a lot of important work on the BP oil disaster together, and I couldn't have done it without him. And down in New Orleans, the hopeful versus hopeless paradox. I mean, that's why I included that quote from Stephen Jenkinson as well as the Václav Havel quote, because I agreed with that quote of Jenkinson's, where he sees it as basically a false paradox or a con job, as he put it, just two sides of the same coin, like you have to choose. Because, you know, like I was going out and giving these climate talks, and the brunt of those talks was just the devastating information. You know, it was like 45 minutes of extremely intense, heartbreaking download. And by the end of the talk, you know, most people felt like I just showed up and gave them a gut punch. And I guess I kind of did. And I had to basically come into realizing that it's really not a choice between, oh, I have to, because what I was faced with when I knew the climate data and had seen these places with my own eyes with leading scientists on the planet, I knew that having hope is akin to being a child whistling in the dark, that it was just not true. You know, to try to have hope was a lie. And also to be utterly hopeless, which I had also gone down that road of thinking, oh, for sure, humans are going extinct and there's nothing that's going to stop it, and nobody can convince me otherwise because I've got the information. And I lived a long time in that place as well, and that was also a lie. That was also, and plus it just was not helpful at all for someone trying to live and be effective and be of service. And so that's when that information came to me again, where I had my friend Stan Rushworth, who I mentioned, saying, look, from an indigenous perspective, we don't do things based on results. And that's another big difference culturally, that the dominant culture, and for me, like I went to Iraq as a war reporter in hopes that that was going to help end the occupation. You know, I was doing that work for some kind of a result. And of course it didn't, you know, and there's US forces still in Iraq. And for a long time, I was very, very angry and upset about that. And then that's kind of evolved through different stories, even my BP reporting in the Gulf on up to the climate crisis. And then this book, I had to face the fact that if I'm doing this work at this time, hoping to get a certain result, I am inevitably going to be depressed and disappointed and let down. It's impossible. You know, the odds are completely against us on all these fronts. But that's where it comes down to, I need to take the right action because it's the right action to take. And when I am of service and when I am looking at those primary obligations that I mentioned, then I am relieved of being attached to the result of my work, as well as realizing, PS, oh, I never had control over that anyway. But I am absolutely relieved of that, being attached to that. And then it doesn't matter what the result is. And that doesn't mean that I don't care, but it means that, you know, nothing's going to stop me from going and taking the right action. And if I can find something that I think is going to help, even if it's just a young kid who lives over here not far from me on land, helping to take care of land a little bit better, or having him have a good time, or helping him learn certain things, or doing things to serve my niece and my nephew that I mentioned, then I'm going to go do those things. And I've actually found great joy in doing those things. And that's not ignoring the fact that we're in all these crises, but it's amidst that, you know, and really kind of get down into the brass tacks. And that also, of course, brings in, and it's not a coincidence, I'm talking to this group, and you know, that Earl is sitting with us right here, that this brings in, we have to have some kind of core fundamental spirituality. And in the broader left, that's usually not, it's a taboo topic to talk about. But I think at these times, whatever your personal spiritual practice is, I've also had to really ramp that up myself as well.
Robert, I think something that will help is the expression that the opposite of despair is not hope, but courage. And Dahr has so much of it that he probably doesn't even think about it the way I'm more courage challenged than he is. But that is the dichotomy, and it is found. It's also found in the Gita. It's also found in so many other sacred works that talk about do the right thing, leave the outcome to the gods or God or whatever you believe in, to the universe. And so that's exactly what I hear Dahr saying. So I hope that helps.
Well, I have heard that all my life, but with Dahr, I was confronting it in my actual working situation. And Dahr, you said the word joy, and that was going to be my next question, but you've answered it. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Robert. Ted, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, I've been aware of this for quite a while also, and realizing that, in fact, I quipped that we're headed for a new era. We aren't ready for the contractions, and we've experienced in the last 10 years at least 3 major contractions: the economic change over the energy crisis of petroleum, this pandemic, and then this year already on the climate issues. I'm concerned on basically the concept is in order to best adapt and thrive, or at least maintain some sort of semblance of normal life, what is recommended that basically we should have a grab and go bag. So like people in California that experience the forest fires could get out for at least 3 days, or like in the pandemic that we should have at least 2 weeks of essentials stored. But we also know that many people in early stages of life, or people who are born of circumstances that will not allow them to do so, what can our organizations do in order to basically help provide some essentials themselves, and think about that what we can do to help those in our congregations or our membership groups, or and those in our vicinity. And I would be interested in any brainstorming on this issue.
Well, just on a personal level, because I certainly, I think am not really qualified to talk about it in an organizational perspective. But, for me personally, I live on the Olympic Peninsula, Washington State. And so we have the Cascadia subduction zone right out here off the coast, 60 miles, which is expected to go anytime. And so we've been instructed out here that if that goes and the tsunami comes from it, when that goes and the tsunami comes, then they'd start rebuilding Seattle first and then work their way out. And we're kind of the end of the road out here. So we're told to, you need to be prepared 6 to 8 weeks on your own. So that means, freeze-dried food and cook stoves and, basic, water filtration, things like that. And I think, what this last year and then, all during the Trump administration showed us is that ultimately we're, in what I saw in Iraq and some of the other failed states that I worked in as a journalist, that, I see this country really as becoming a failed state. And what's happening in the government, where literally you've got, basically 48% of the current government, the Democrats with a hair majority are, all about authoritarianism, and their whole policy is voter suppression. That's it. They don't even have a policy. And so if that energy comes back into power, as we just saw under Trump, well, we saw what happened. where we're basically left on our own as a population, whether it comes to dealing with a pandemic or what happens when wildfires roll through. I mean, you know, we're living in increasingly in a situation where I think it's just common sense to have ourselves and the people we love. We need to set ourselves up the best we can to try to at least have a little bit of a buffer, so that if, you know, we have some sort of system collapse, whether it's wildfires coming through is a great example. You know, how can I feed and water myself for X amount of time and things like that. And I think that's part of the adaptation also, that someone mentioned that word. I'm sorry, maybe it was you, Ted, of in a climate crisis world that we are in now, that, you know, and I live in an area too, where, you know, I need to be prepared for wildfires and I need to be prepared for drought, because we're already having them up here in Washington State, even on the western side, from time to time. And so what do I need to do to prepare myself, and not leave myself open and reliant upon authorities who may or may not be able to provide that service, you know. And that's a big if, because in some places they can and they do, and in other places they can't for whatever reasons.
So do you have a grab and go bag and 2 weeks supply at home? And could you share a little bit more so people might survive 2 weeks also?
Well, for me, I do, because I spend a lot of time in the backcountry, so I have loads of backcountry equipment and stoves and foods. And like I said, we have to be prepared for the Cascadia subduction zone out here, and most people out here are. And so, you know, most people out here could live for a month on their own, and, you know, having water filtration and things like that. So it's just basic things like, you know, food, water, shelter, you know. And then if you knew a fire was going to come, do I know, you know, do I have medications I need to grab, valuables, keep, you know, important photos, or, you know, family things like that, you know, things I can go grab in like 2 minutes and then go. I think it's part of that climate disrupted world. That's kind of some of the thinking that we have to start engaging in.
My question then is, does Quimper have something, if nothing more than say a dinner that they could call the congregation together and have dinner and provide filtered water and things of that nature if things got worse or not?
Ted, let me try to deal with the Unitarian questions. So where are you located?
Mankato, Minnesota.
Okay, and do you have a congregation there or nearby?
Correct.
Okay, so one of the things that's very easy to do is just check and see whether you have a local climate action group or elders climate action group or anything along that line, to find out who's doing what to whom in that sense. And then also work with this organization, UUJEC, UU's for Just Economic Community, and UUMFE, UU Ministry for Earth. The two organizations have been working together because we recognize that this is a problem not only of the environment, but it is a big time people problem. And the people who suffer the most usually are the ones who are the poorest, regardless of color. And so there are a whole bunch of resources. And if you need further assistance, I'm at earl.coteen@gmail.com. Just send me an email with your phone number and we can talk about finding resources. And with that, I'm going to switch to a question from the chat from Chris. And he asked, have you ever used the En-ROADS, that's capital E, small n, hyphen, capital ROADS, computer program game with groups? And what do you think about it as a teaching method or a device to get users active in the struggle?
That's the first I've heard of it, so I don't have any experience with it.
Okay, and now we've got another question.
En-ROADS, the UUJEC had a web seminar a few months ago on En-ROADS, which should be on our website if people want to check it out. we found it interesting. It's a simulation. Kind of what you assume affects what kind of results you get out, but it's good to wake people up, I think.
Okay, thank you, Sally. So Jane asked, Dahr, tell us about deep adaptation.
Deep adaptation, it comes from Jim Bindell. He used to work for the UN, and he basically came out as a whistleblower. He was engaged in work with the UN, talking about sustainability projects around the world and such. And he continued to educate himself on the gravity of the climate crisis and wrote a paper called Deep Adaptation that has been published and read millions of times at this point, I think. And that paper basically talks about a lot of what I've talked about in as far as, look, we're completely off the cliff as far as we're not going to turn this ship around. There's so many climate changes and feedback loops locked in now that it's inevitable that we're living on a changed and changing planet, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. That mitigation, the full scale mitigation that would have to happen to really have an impact, to actually really shave some degrees off the worst case projected scenarios, is clearly not happening by governments around the world. So what's left to do, the only common sense thing to do is, of course, keep working towards mitigation if that's what you feel deeply moved, but it really brings out the imperative of adaptation. And so that first adaptation that Bindell talks about, and I have nothing but praise for his work. I think it's excellent, necessary, super, super helpful. And one of the premises of deep adaptation, it basically starts here. Like, okay, first I have to get my head and my heart around what that really means. And that inevitably is going to mean a lot of grief work and finding other people to have community with around this. And then physically, okay, once I accept that's where we really are, then what do I really want and need to do? And it really comes down into really asking these important questions of ourselves and really coming into that. And that's essentially what that work is about. And anyone who hasn't read his paper, I highly recommend it. And then he's written enormous amounts of material and given just a huge number of presentations talking about this, and is really kind of a leading edge figure on kind of helping people come to terms with what's going on in a really good way. Because it's so easy to get cynical or despondent or depressed, but I think it's really positive work that really helps people kind of get it up here and then have this information come down into here and then respond accordingly from that place, instead of kind of the panic or the depression or the anger, which it's so easy to get into. So that's, I hope that helps at least shed a little bit of light on that. But I would definitely recommend folks give that a read. And I think there's a deep adaptation group on Facebook that's very, very big. And yeah, they do a lot of really good work.
Thank you. This next question, I'm going to cheat and give part of the answer to, and that is, how can we persuade people that the climate crisis is even larger than COVID-19 and is much more serious? And I would encourage people to look at Climate ECOS. That's Echo Charlie Oscar Sam. And they have a series of webinars there. They're attached to the UN, and they are focusing on just this question: how do we educate people? And they also have some other information, like they did a presentation on En-ROADS, and they've done presentations on something called Powers of 10. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Dahr, but I just thought I'd throw in a little there.
So I'm sorry, Earl, if you can maybe kind of paraphrase what part of that question you'd like me to respond to.
The basic question is, how do we persuade people?
Oh, yeah.
That the climate crisis is so much bigger a threat than COVID-19.
Yeah, I know it's basically been kind of effectively lost from being the elephant in the middle of the room that we were all looking and talking at for a long time. And then the pandemic has certainly kind of brought that out of consciousness. I've kind of stopped trying to convince anybody of anything, because what I've learned is that the people who, well, for example, I have a couple of family members who just don't believe the climate crisis. And for a long time, I decided it was my responsibility as a journalist to take it upon myself to try to convince them. And so doing things like writing a book with 21 pages of footnotes that's winning science awards isn't going to do it. And what I had to realize, it's because someone who's not believing in the gravity of the climate crisis, that's out of fear. And if I'm trying to use intellectual information to reach someone who's in fear, I mean, I would imagine a lot of people in this group are familiar with the fight or flight or freeze responses to trauma. And when someone's, when one of us gets activated, if we're attacked or we're in trauma and, we're in fight, flight, or fear, I mean, there's all these scientific studies that show this doesn't work anymore. I'm not operating from here. I'm operating in a visceral, how do I stay alive situation. So it doesn't matter how many encyclopedias of data I give to someone about the climate crisis or whatever it is I'm trying to explain. If they're in so much fear that they can't even acknowledge that the threat is real, or they're in the denial stage, if we talk about it from the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross model, then I'm wasting my breath and they're not going to hear one word that I say. And so eventually the crisis itself will show those people there will be no denying it. So whether that looks like their house burning down in a wildfire or being swept away by a hurricane or whatever it is, but ultimately the crisis will be big enough that it directly severely impacts everyone, at which point they'll get the memo at that point, I would assume. But those who aren't really willing to go there yet, I think frankly, I found it a waste of time, especially when there's loads of other people that really do want to know the information.
And here I see a question from David, and then Lucy, you could go next after that. The question from David is, Dahr, are you familiar with Saul Griffin and Electrify America?
I'm not, sorry.
Okay, Sally, take it away.
I mean, Lucy.
Lucy, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I'm just Charlie Brown today.
I guess my despair on this subject is not how awful it is of the climate. I've kind of left that because I do a lot of action, which makes me much happier about it. But the sadness is what's come up about being with people who don't seem to buy into that. And what I've found lately is that starting a work project of any kind brings people along. I live in a sustainable community, but it's not climate related. It's more how to be good to the land we're on. And what I've noticed, and this is partly due, I think, because COVID has kept us so isolated, that to just start a project on the land and invite people to come gets a group together where we then begin to talk about things together. And what I want to say is you don't have to be an expert about anything to do that. You just need the willingness to be a leader in the sense of bringing it up and inviting people, whether it's in a congregation or in a community. I've been amazed at how people really want to do something, and that leads to a deeper conversation while we're working on a project, whether it's planting trees or examining the land we're on to see what we can do for invasive plants. Or, I mean, they may be very small things, but it's a beginning, it's an action, and it invites community.
Yeah, thank you. And I just, the only thing I would add to that is to kind of underscore the community part. And, you know, I've realized that, and, you know, since writing this book, also the importance of community, that nobody gets through this by themselves. You know, no more of this lone wolf, pull yourself up by your bootstrap stuff. That, you know, this is, and this is something that I've been learning a lot more deeply. I'm actually co-authoring a book interviewing Indigenous people, and co-authoring it with an Indigenous man, and just person after person talks about that, you know, in community is how we get through these things, you know, and looking at, like, again, looking at Native Americans, that they've already been through genocide. They've been through abrupt climate change. You know, you want to talk about abrupt climate change? Well, take an entire people and put them in a completely different bioregion and say, okay, here, now you have to live here, and literally overnight. And then you have to adapt. Well, they've done that, and they're still here, and they did that by maintaining community, and that's how you get through this. And I found that personally. Like, I've gone to great lengths to meet all my neighbors, and I'm fortunate enough to live on land where we can have little fires pretty much whenever we want, and we always have a fire, invite neighbors, and we just come and talk. And, you know, sometimes it's about something serious, and then oftentimes it's not, you know, but just the importance of just hanging out. Hey, what are you working on? What are you doing? You know, and just know. And so then if something big does come down the pike, then, you know, we know these people, and we can work together.
I have a comment here from Elaine that I would like to share because I believe it so strongly myself. She says, I thought your first person descriptions of the disappearing ice you saw around the world were incredibly heartbreaking and convincing, much more than numbers and statistics. Thank you. And I definitely want to second that emotion. So many times people come in with numbers and statistics, and, you know, but your first person account, what you observed and your ability to describe it, it's really, really powerful. And I thank you for it. I'm sure the rest of us do as well.
Yeah, well, thank you. And thank you for that comment. And that was really my goal of the book, that, you know, I too, you know, we can read scientific studies all day, but until we really go experience that firsthand, or talk with someone who has, and really feel it person to person, what that means, then my goal of doing it that way was just in hopes that it would help people care more about the planet, you know, that because it's so easy to be detached, and how most of us live in big cities now, and it's so easy to forget that, you know, we are part of the planet. And so to really, really, you know, have a place, you know, for me, that where my favorite place is to go into the mountains where there's glaciers, and to watch that go away, watch those things go away, it broke my heart. And I think that we all have some place in nature that particularly appeals to us. And if we see that place being injured, or destroyed, or being taken out, you know, we're gonna care. And so that was my goal of the book, is just to really help people remember that, which I think we all already knew, but we tend to forget, or for various reasons. So thank you very much for that comment.
Dahr, Kathy writes, in my years of teaching environmental science, I learned that the biological definition of community is all living organisms interacting in a specific area at a given time. So community is much more complex than only humans. Would you like to say anything about community as all living things within your area of interest or reach?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. You know, another thing that I get, you know, working on the book that I mentioned earlier, now my new project, is, you know, when, in most of this community probably is aware of this, that Native Americans in their prayers with whatever their particular languaged word is for all my relations. And that means, you know, I say the prayer for all my relations, and not just every other human, which is all my relations, which is profound enough in itself, but all my relations means everything. It means, you know, the winged ones, the four-leggeds, the swimmers, everything, the rock people, the tree people, you know, the Star people, everything. And so, you know, my partner is Indigenous, and, you know, we were out on a walk yesterday, and, you know, we walked across, you know, a little patch of these tiny little flowers were coming up as it's spring up here. And, you know, and she stops and she's like, I don't even want to walk across them because my grandmother taught me, like, you know, she would apologize to them and then find another way. And, you know, like that kind of thinking, you know, that kind of thinking. Or if I'm going to take something from the forest, ask permission and then listen, and maybe I shouldn't take it. But like that kind of thinking of all my relations. And that's a completely different ontology than that which has brought us to this point of crisis where, you know, we've literally caused the sixth mass extinction. And so I think that's the shift of consciousness where if we get back to that, then there's a chance that some of us are going to keep going forward. But if not enough of us get to that shift, then, you know, it's kind of hard to envision that. But I think it would have to start with that kind of really heart consciousness that, no, we are absolutely connected to everything and we have to behave accordingly.
And Sally, your comment about protecting our waters, is that a comment or a question, or do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, it was actually protecting our winters, which is a group of skiers and snowboarders and winter athletes who are very concerned about climate change because they're seeing their space go away, their snow is retreating and so forth. And the other thing was that I was thinking as Dahr spoke about, the Native American religions are so inherent to their space. They say, you know, we don't evangelize because what works as a religion in the northwest of the country has nothing to do with the southwest. It's so embedded in that space and in that geography, climate, etc. Just some random thoughts.
So do you want Dahr to respond to that, Sally? Or?
If you'd like.
Well, that's not entirely true. The book that I have mentioned, we're interviewing people from all across the country and one person up in Canada. And actually what I'm seeing is quite the opposite of that, where the commonalities of living in community with everyone and everything, of knowing that we are part of the earth and the earth is our mother, and that we need to behave accordingly, and not just for the present tense, but for all the generations that have come before and all the generations yet to come. And just basic, an ontological way of life that really includes those modes of thinking, as well as the best way to comport ourselves, no matter what, under all circumstances. That there's actually, you know, a very, very numerous lines of commonality between indigenous cultures around the entire planet. I saw that down in the Amazon. I've seen it in Australia. I've seen it in the Middle East. I've seen it everywhere I've gone. That there is, you know, and there's plenty of writing and things that speak to this as well. But that there's these basic commonalities, and it all comes down to we are part of the earth. The earth is our mother. The mother is not going to forsake her children. So kind of this mindset of, oh, well, the earth's just going to go on without us anyway. And yeah, that might be true if that's what she has to do in order to stay alive herself, but that's definitely not the first choice. I mean, there's just numerous things like that are, anyway, that last point was a bit of a digression, but I think that, you know, indigenous cultures around the planet have far more in common with each other. It doesn't matter what their bioregion is.
And you have a compliment here on a presentation you gave to the QUMPERUU, I don't know, QUMPERUU, and I don't even know where that is.
Oh, it's the so there's the Olympic Peninsula, and then the northeast tip of it is called the Quimper Peninsula. And that's
Ah,
where I live here. So that's the QU, that's the Unitarian church here. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's probably on their website, so that's good. And there's Lucy recommends a book, and David, I see your hand, and I'll call on you next. Lucy recommends a book, The Rights of Nature: A Legal Revolution That Could Save the World, by David R. Boyd. I don't know whether that's been on your reading list or not, Dahr.
I haven't read it, but I'm aware of it. It's, yeah, that's an amazing movement. And in fact, there was just a river that obtained its own legal rights status up in Canada in the last week. That's, you know, along the, as example of that.
Okay. And David, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yes, Earl, I want to thank you for suggesting that folks might consider looking at the website for Elders Climate Action, known as ECA. I have been involved with ECA since its beginning in 2014 when it was 15 people. It's now 10,000 individuals, and recently the board has set a goal of being 2 million members by 2025. So it's a growing organization, and I recommend it to those of you who are looking for others who share your concerns about the future. I was the one, by the way, that asked the question of Dahr whether he was familiar with Saul Griffith and Electrifying America. Saul is an incredible individual. He's based in Australia, went to MIT, got a Genius Grant from the MacArthur Foundation for his innovative thinking. And what he is saying is that we need to understand that we're all consumers, and that as consumers, we can help build the electrical infrastructure of the United States by thinking about replacing every one of our devices, major purchases, with electric when the opportunity comes forward. Because the future, in his opinion, if we're to deal with climate change and begin to bring down carbon dioxide in the environment, in the atmosphere, is to go with wind and solar. And I happen to be a fan of nuclear because it doesn't produce carbon dioxide. So for those of you who haven't thought about what you can do as consumers, I would recommend to think about that. And the highest priority would be looking at replacing your gas-powered car with an electric vehicle when the opportunity comes. If you have a gas-fired dryer in your home and it goes bad, replace it with an electric. And you can use a heat pump rather than a gas furnace. And so doing will help, in his opinion, to build the proper infrastructure for a better future for the planet. And I'll just conclude by saying that I learned about what was then called global warming from Roger Revelle, an oceanographer who was one of 3 scientists who got the government to establish the carbon dioxide monitoring station in 1959 at the top of Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And that data was used in his class when he taught Al Gore. And Al Gore has been one of the primary spokespeople from a political background about the need to address climate change. I have much hope for the future because I've been worried about this and acting on it. I taught for 20 years as a science teacher at Sidwell Friends School. I wanted to educate future generation of voters. I think we're moving in the right direction. I'm really very optimistic, especially now that we have President Biden speaking out on this issue. 10 years ago, nobody was talking about it seriously.
Thanks, David. Dahr, did you want to respond to that?
No, thanks.
Okay. There are a couple of other book recommendations here. Sally, is there any possibility that when this ends, that you could go ahead and save the chat and distribute it to
Yes, I've been
our
saving
other
it as we go along. And if anybody's not on our email list and you want to put your email address in the chat, I can make sure that you get that as well.
Okay. Ted Downey recommends drawdown.org, and so do I. And the book as well. Are you familiar with that, Dahr?
I am. I'm a bit critical of it because I think that, you know, I'm not into the techno fix thing with the climate crisis. It just flies in the face of the feedback loops that I'm already aware of that can't be turned down. And I think it, at least maybe whether it was the intention or not is not mine to decide, but it seems like it's been used as a kind of selling some false hope to a lot of folks who read it. I think also it's more important for folks to adapt accordingly to where they are in whatever region of the country, in whatever ways within their capacity, and taking full responsibility ourselves for that adaptation. So if the book promotes some of that, then great. But I know that at least cursorily, some of the thinking behind it and some of the people involved at the higher echelons, it didn't seem super viable to me.
Kathy, you have your hand raised. Please
Yeah,
unmute yourself.
Thank you. I just wanted to quickly follow up on what I think it was David. Was it you that was talking about the using electric cars and so on? Yeah. I wanted to add that it's not only, I mean, electricity per se, you got to look at what generates the electricity. And I just wanted to make that point that our electrical system at this point in time, you know, everybody knows this. We use a lot of coal, we use natural gas. Some systems use some oil. So, you know, ultimately, it would be awesome if people who had cars that were electric could have a little solar panel system or something like that. So, I mean, it's not quite as simple as just, you know, using electricity, because that's part of the problem too.
Thank you, Kathy. Robert again.
Could I respond to that?
And then David. David, yes. If Robert, if you could wait just a second,
No,
let's let him do a direct response. David?
Yeah, Kathy,
Go
to
ahead.
Kathy's point, I have a Chevy Volt, which is a hybrid that can go 70 miles in good weather on a single charge. If I need it, I have a gasoline engine which generates electricity that allows me to get home if my battery goes out. And I don't feel a lick of guilt about the coal-fired power plants that exist in Virginia, even though I live in Northern Virginia, because for 20 years I have been paying extra to invest in solar and wind. As far as I'm concerned, the grid is being supplied by those facilities. And from that point of view, I'm not contributing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Everyone has an opportunity to do the same.
I don't want to make this a long argument about energy, because I don't think that's the main topic we're dealing with here.
Okay.
Thank you, David. Robert.
Yes, Dahr, I was just trained as one of Al Gore's climate trainers, and I've been asked to be a faith mentor for the next training. I'm going to read your book before I take on that task. I think it's hard, very hard for me, so I know it'll be hard for everybody I'll be mentoring, to take this point of view between, as I mentioned before, hopefulness and hopelessness and the realization that what we do brings us joy because it's the right thing to do, and we don't know the outcome. Actually, we really can't predict it. We don't know what the results of our actions will be. We can only do the right thing and take joy in that. And somehow that seems like a very strong message that I'll bring them. I have a question for you now, though. Francis of Assisi is made out to be a sort of cartoonish figure in preaching to the birds, but he spoke of brother sun and sister moon. And I hear him preaching to the birds because he believed that they could in some way understand him. And I think the present Pope looks at him that way, not as a cute medieval figure, but as actually someone with a profound message. What do you have any, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I was wondering, do you have any opinions, judgments, and so on of the Pope's approach and the Catholic Church's response to the Pope and so on? I know it's a heavy question, and if you don't want to answer it, that's okay.
Well, I know that the current Pope's response to the climate crisis is, how can you not applaud it? Acknowledging the severity and how real it is, and encouraging the Catholic Church's followers to be aware of that and respond accordingly as well. And I mean, I from what I've seen, and I haven't followed this closely, but just from what I've seen in the news, the Pope's basically stance on the climate crisis is to be applauded. I don't see how it's not, just really is a good example as well. And I appreciate what you shared, Robert, again, about just that, the overwhelm, and we have to have the facts and really understand the gravity of the crisis in order to respond accordingly. And another analogy that I use in the book is at the time, my best friend up until when he passed was a man that I used to work for as a personal assistant. He was quadriplegic, and I was his personal attendant. And we spent a lot of years together doing that. And then even when I stopped working for him personally, we maintained our friendship. And in 2016, he contracted pneumonia, which for those of us, anyone who knows somebody in a wheelchair, let alone quadriplegic, to get pneumonia is a really big deal, because you're already really compromised, and the ability to come through a respiratory crisis like that is pretty grim. And I sat with him and was taking shifts sitting with him, and when he was in the ICU for 3 weeks, and it really looked like this was it. He just kept going down and down and down over time. But it made me, being that cognizant of the crisis, made me that much more present, just knowing like this could be my last time with him, and he's still here, and he ended up pulling out of that. But my point of the story is that if we are truly in a hospice situation with the planet, and we don't know for sure that we are, but if we're truly in a hospice situation, then who wouldn't want to be aware of that, so that we would have the opportunity to be as fully present as we can. And then, the people who say, oh, well, that might mean, people are just not going to care or whatever. It's like, no, I would argue the opposite, that it would make you care that much more, as though you're sitting at the bedside of someone that you love dearly. And if you know that every minute could be their last, you're going to love them and care about them more and better than you ever have before. And so I think that's why it's so imperative to not mince words and say, look, this is where we are in the crisis. And it's really important that everyone understands. Otherwise, they're not going to have the opportunity to really respond accordingly.
Beautiful answer. Thank you.
Dahr, one of the things I've been most impressed with is that at the Bellingham, Washington UU, a single individual reached out to the local tribe and finally got the tribe and the congregation together. And then she publicized what she was doing to UUMFE, the UU Ministry for Earth. And they had in essence, they all went camping. But the purpose of the camping was to climb in canoes and throw salmon at the whales because the whales were starving because of the changing conditions. I don't know whether you're familiar with that effort, but what disturbs me about Unitarians is that we haven't done enough in terms of environmental justice. We haven't made that many connections with communities that are suffering. So, you know, I'm doing something very different than you in the sense I'm in Berkeley, but most of my justice work has been up in Richmond, California, or down in Oakland, because the places that are being most poisoned are those near the ports, those near the refineries. So you sort of have to go, go where the action is. And so I'm just, any thoughts about what they did in Bellingham, whether that was something you were familiar with, and outreach to Indigenous and people of color and so forth?
Well, I'm not familiar with that specific action, but it sounds amazing. And you know, one thing that we're coming to, this book that I'm working on, which is, it's called The Changing Earth, Indigenous Voices from Turtle Island. And one thing we're kind of coming to at the end is we're considering an idea of what, so, okay, anyone who would read this book and be moved by what Indigenous folks are talking about, what can they do? And one of the ideas, you know, in a nutshell, of if we were going to put everything we had into one idea, that I thought is maybe we should just say, you know, if you don't already know whose land you're on right now, if you're not Indigenous, find out whose land you're on and contact that tribe and go ask how you can be of service to them, and then do what they say. You know, 85% of all biological diversity on the planet today is on Indigenous owned land. That's not by accident. So think about that. That one statistic to me says it all. And so if we're really seriously going to work to try to protect and save what's left, Indigenous communities are already doing it. They've been doing it. And, you know, that's a heck of a place to start.
Great, thank you. And I have a note here from Diane. Yeah, Diane. And Dahr, what do you say to children about the state of our earth and our crisis? I'm heartbroken thinking about the children whose future is so dark.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's extremely important. I wrestled with this for a long time, and like I said, I don't have my own kids, but I have a niece and nephews, and they're now teenagers, from early to older teenagers. And what I learned was, the first thing is they already know. At least I'm talking about a specific age. I'm not talking about little kids, but at least the teenagers that I've interacted with, is that I learned is that since they were born into this, and I had to kind of come into awareness of it after I was born and raised, that they already know. I mean, I went on a backpacking trip with my nephew. He was 15 at the time, and he just wanted me to be absolutely frank with him, and so I did. I just spoke very, very frankly, and he said, "Yeah, I already knew we're going to be living in a different world. I didn't know all the scientific details, but he wanted to hear them." And so I think it's very important to be honest and not sell false hope or pretend like somehow this isn't going to happen, but just be very honest and say, yeah, we're in a crisis, and all the science, and not just the science, but what's right in front of our eyes is showing us is that things are only going to intensify. And it's going to be a lot more challenging for you living on this planet than it has been for me. And now we're all in this together, and we all, you know, and I just let him know. My own personal experience was, look, I'm here, and I'm here for you. And, you know, if you want to think about this and talk about this, then please call me, and let's do that together, you know, because you're in a situation where you're going to be having to make very different decisions in your 20s than I was, you know, because when I went to college, it was like, well, you know, okay, what do I want to do? And just kind of this idea that the world was just going to go on indefinitely. And now, you know, he's already in a point as a teenager where does it even make sense to go to college? You know, maybe it makes more sense to go learn a trade or woodworking or something like this, you know, or medical care or naturopathy or something like this. So I just found it, you know, the core part was just to be honest. And most of the younger generations, I mean, excluding obviously much younger kids, they already know because they're born into it. And like my generation, I had to deal with the grief process. Well, he was just pissed. You know, there's no grief process really. He was just pissed because he's like, look at what's you guys have done. And now what? You know, now what am I supposed to do? So like, that's the kind of conversations that we had and are having.
Yes, anger is certainly part of the stages of grief as well as fear. I do want to pass on something from Bill McKibben, who's a longtime Sunday school teacher at his Methodist church. And what he said is by the age of 7 is a good time to start having the talk. And it's interesting because I think that parallels what the Unitarians and the United Church of Christ have done with Our Whole Lives, which is our sex education program. Now, what you teach a 7-year-old and what you teach a 14-year-old obviously is very different. But just bringing up the topic, because they will often learn, you know, outside of parental guidance or guidance of elders, and it's good to help them unravel their questions even at that early an age. So if your RE program isn't doing that now, your religious education program, that is an opportunity that can be lifted up.
Well, that's helpful to hear that even with the really younger kids, that's still the best tack to take. I mean, that's helpful for me personally to hear because, you know, I think it'd be easy to fall into that trap of like, oh, well, they're just too young, you know, to do that. 7's pretty young, so that's good to hear.
Yeah, well, again, it has to be tailored to their age, but that's a recommendation McKibben gives based on years and years of doing Sunday school teaching at his Methodist church. And I see Karen has got her hand raised.
Can you hear me? This is a very specific little thing, but it's sort of, when you were talking about little kids and stuff, made me think of it. I'd heard or recently heard that the hunters and gatherers had like 1,000 vegetables that they ate. And for us, we're down to like practically like 8 that we commonly eat. And it just seemed like there are a lot of things out there maybe that we don't see that we could start using. Weeds that we think are weeds, stuff like this. That was very, I mean, anyway, just, I don't know. When I heard kids, I thought, oh, kids could be looking for things. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you. Dahr, you want to respond or?
I don't think I have anything to add to that.
Okay, great, thank you. So I've been trying to follow the feed in the chat as best I can, but I was not expecting to do quite this much multitasking. So if there's anyone who does have a question, please raise your hand, because I'm going to close the chat so I can see everyone. And if you don't have your video on, you can raise your hand by going into participants and make a choice there. Yeah, Sally says you can go into reactions, but that's more
Depending on
for,
your version of Zoom.
yeah, that's more for saying thumbs up, thumbs down, I cry, that sort of thing. Okay, do we have any more questions? If not, we're finishing 10 minutes early. Miraculous. Now there's the real miracle. Dahr, this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for this. And I see people applauding, and they're also thanking you in the chat. Cindy, would you like to do some closing words?
You're muted.
You're still muted. Oh, now you're on.
Well, I just appreciate Dahr coming and sharing his truth with us. And I'm thinking that one reason that we might be closing earlier is that this has been such an impactful bit of time here, because it's a hard reality to think that it's as bleak as it is, and that we are not doing the things that we need to do to turn it around. And I know that there's a number of people in this group that really are making serious efforts to try to turn it around. But our governments, from my point of view, are failing a lot of us. And so I guess maybe I have, rather than a final word, I might ask Dahr about that. You know, in terms of a small minority really doing everything they can, do you think it's possible that if we were to gain control of our governments, that we would have any hope at all? Sorry, Dahr.
Well, I think that it just always comes down to our own individual actions. You know, I think gaining control of the government in this country at this point in time is a fantasy, and it's not going to happen. So what's my responsibility to do right here? And just like what Wendell Berry talks about, that starts in me, and then in my house, and then in my immediate community. And I think we're at a position now, especially in this country, where, you know, that those kind of concentric circles are really what are realistic to look at, like our immediate local environment, and to take those actions and try to affect, you know, hopefully they would affect change in those areas. But bottom line is, what's the right action? Where can I be of the most service, and then go do that. And that can only ever be on a local level, the way I see it. And so, but then if knowing, like, if everyone else is doing the same thing, then maybe we're getting somewhere, you know, and we don't know how many other people are. But I mean, I can tell you that, you know, I mean, the talk I gave up here to the UU, and then with this group, you know, what I see consistently is a whole lot of people around the whole country doing a whole lot of really great work.
I just want to add, as an institutionalist, years ago, Reverend Fred Small, whom many of you may know, and he's the author of the 360 song, or 350 song. He wrote or said, changing light bulbs is good, changing senators is better. And this was after they had elected Elizabeth Warren. We recently had a miracle in Georgia. And we had the miracle in Georgia because people canvassed, because people made phone calls, because people supported the organizations that were doing that work. So, at least from my perspective, while government is often the problem, corporations make governments look like saints. And if we're ever going to be able to rein in this corporate terror we're living in, then we need to take over the government. And I would prefer to do it peacefully, but I'm not confident we will be able to do that. But we won't be able to do that if we don't fight for voter rights and do the other things necessary. Otherwise, in 2022, we're going to have the pendulum swing back the other way, and we'll be back into the dark days of a do-nothing Senate. And we can't afford that. Our children can't afford it. Our grandchildren can't afford it. Nothing on the planet can afford that. we must find a new way to lead. Sorry, I'm a minister, so I get to preach every once in a while.
Your sermon is heard.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what we can say to each other is to offer our heartfelt love to one another as all of us being part of the same human family, and take Dahr's words to heart and just do the best that we can with the time that we have and move forward and do what we feel led to do in our own lives. So I thank you all for coming. Go in peace and in love.
Thank you all.
Thanks a
Bye-bye.
lot,
Thanks,
everybody.
Dahr.